Alright, so we're back, y'all. We're going to look at Chapter 5. Let's pull it up. Go ahead and minimize myself. Alright, so, y'all, Chapter 5, From Empire to Independence. So, again, in Chapter 4, we looked at what was going on within the British Empire here in America and how that was developing. And we kind of finished up with that, with the French and Indian War and what that did in regards to setting the stage for moving forward. And again, think about it. What's happened now? That neighborhood, in essence, that I talked about before. We eliminated one of the neighbors. We kicked them out and we split their territory between us and Spain, right? The natives were still there, but the Europeans aren't giving them any credit. They're not giving them any of the land, right? It's not like they're saying, oh, hey, yeah, you can have this. But in essence, the British will kind of do something like that. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, but here in chapter 5, we're going to look at that moment of taking us basically from the Treaty of Paris 1763 until we get to, in essence, July of 1776, where we're declaring our independence. All right, so what happens? What happens in basically that 14-year span from the end of the French and Indian War until, I say 14 years, but 1763 to 1776, that 13-year span, until July of 1776, right? So let's take a look. Here we go. Yeah, the war's aftermath. Okay, so a couple things we need to pay attention to. We need to go back and talk about that war. So the war's aftermath. With France out of the Americas, the colonists now look to expand into the West. Okay, but we're going to get a couple events. Pontiac's Rebellion and then ultimately the Proclamation of 1763 we need to talk about. Okay, so Pontiac's Rebellion, again, Treaty of Paris 1763 ends the war, but also in 1763 we have these other two events. Okay, Pontiac's Rebellion is going to be the first one. This was a Native American revolt in the Ohio Valley. Natives were trying to push the British out, but the British are ultimately going to win. We see an early form of biological warfare coming into play. By this point in time, y'all, it's understood, it's well known that the natives didn't have a lot of immunities to European diseases. So what we see actually happening is that not the British military, but some British colonists will actually take blankets that had been used by people who had smallpox, and they will make sure that those blankets find their way into the Native American village. The Native Americans, many of them being contract and ultimately are going to die of smallpox. So ultimately, the British are able to win this by using an early form of biological warfare. And again, y'all, let me stress that was some of the British colonists, not necessarily the British military, pursuing that endeavor. There's a little bit of debate about how much the British military knew about this, but it was largely British, the colonists doing this, not so much the British military. But anyway, so we have that. But then the British Parliament is going to issue what's called the Proclamation of 1763. The British government tell the colonists not to go across the Appalachian Mountains. And yes, y'all, it is Appalachian, not Appalachian. I don't care what you learn at some point in time in elementary school or whatever. We're talking about Appalachian Mountains, okay? If you've ever paid attention to it, Appalachian State University. Whatever, just trust me on this. I know you probably like it. So yeah, we're talking about Appalachian Mountains, right? Where they run? They run in this region, right? The Smoky Mountains are a part of that, whatever. So you have the Appalachian Mountains that are running in this region, right? Well, more like that, right? And so what happens is that, yes, the British own all the territory over to the Mississippi River, right? As a matter of fact, let me pull this PowerPoint back up, okay? So if I go to this one, so what we see here, y'all, is that this little bitty line right there, let me blow this back up. This little bitty line right there is ultimately going to be the Proclamation of 1763 line. Basically, the British are telling the American people, don't go past that line. Okay, don't go past the mountains. That's the mountains. Don't go past it. Yes, we control all of this territory. This is all British territory, but we're going to reserve it for the Native Americans. Why? Because if you stay over here and they stay over there, we won't have all this fighting. We won't see things like Pontiac's Rebellion. That's going to happen out in this region, right? So we're going to avoid that if you don't go past this line. British colonists stay over here, Native Americans, y'all stay over here. We're not going to run into these major issues, right? So paying attention to those sorts of things, okay? So that's what the British are ultimately trying to tell their colonists to do. It's Proclamation of 1763. We want to keep you to the east of that line. Don't go west of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, that's something that is ultimately really, really important for them. Okay, now many government actions are going to be controlled by the king and the chief minister. Okay, the English king had gone through many chief ministers, but finally he brings in George of Grenville, and we get some stability. Yeah, when I say chief minister, what I want you to be clear on is that's not like a title. It's not like there's a title called chief minister. Okay, what I mean by that is, think about it like this. There are certain in America we will develop the presidency, and the president has his cabinet, right? Well, there are some presidents that lean really heavily on their Secretary of State, while others lean really heavily on their Secretary of Treasury or Secretary of War or whatever, right? Right. So like everybody could have a different position. Like every president trusts somebody else. Like their closest advisor might be in a different role, right? Well, that's what we see here, y'all. So it's just the chief minister. I just mean it's a high-ranking official that the king is really looking to as their main advisor at that point in time. Okay. So, but anyway, the king is going to bring in George Grenville. And again, the king had gone through a bunch of ministers. And finally, we'll get a little bit of stability when he brings in George Grenville. So, let's take a look at Grenville's policies. Grenville wanted to balance the taxes between the Englishmen, or because the Englishmen were paying more than the American colonists. Okay, so that's his idea. What Grenville wants to do is basically come in. He sees the colonists are paying this much in taxes, the English citizens are paying this much in taxes. He wants to kind of balance that out, right? He believes that the American colonists needed to pay for their share of the war. All those wars were for what? And this is something to keep in mind, y'all. All of those colonial wars, remember, the British are going to look at it as if, well, we fought those wars to protect you, the American colonists. And the American colonists look at it as like, we didn't ask you for all that. Y'all, it's those people, and think about this. This is another way to think about it. You have those people who come in and you go on a road trip with them, right? And you're driving, you're using your car, and then they offer to pay for gas. And you're like, oh, okay, whatever. No, you don't have to, but if you want to, okay, whatever. And then, like, you get to the end of the trip, and they're like, well, hey, look, I want my money back. Well, what do you mean? Like, I didn't ask for your help. You just did it, and now you expect me to pay for it after, right? So, kind of that scenario we kind of see playing out between Great Britain and the American colonies. But anyway, Grenville wanted to balance the taxes because the Englishmen were paying more than the American colonies. He says they need to pay for their share of the war. He also found the customs service in bad shape. Y'all think customs is, if you've ever been through customs in modern world, you think about it, but it's this making sure that things that come into the country are coming in legally, right? So if you go to a foreign country and you come in, you have to declare what you're bringing back from that foreign country, yada, 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 okay? So he found the customs service in bad shape. There was a lot of smuggling. Smuggling was a huge problem. Remember all those navigation acts and different things like that? He believes that a lot of that isn't being followed well. So there's a lot of smuggling. Anybody have any idea who the most famous smuggler in American history was? Like the most famous smuggler at this point in time? I'm sure you all know his name, but you might not realize it. It's going to be a guy by the name of John Hancock. Remember the dude who signs his name real big? Yeah, that same guy. Why does John Hancock sign his name real big on the Declaration of Independence and all that stuff? It's because he wants to make sure the king knows, look, I'm signing my name real big. You came after me, and this is what we see. Grenville's policies, cracking down on smuggling. John Hancock was a big-time rum smuggler. That's how he made a lot of money. He illegally brought rum into the country. Well, he's going to be one of the people who gets these tax policies are going to hurt him, so he gets mad at the king, and he's going to support the revolution. But we'll get to all that. So anyway, what we see is smuggling was a huge problem. Again, we see people like John Hancock. So Grenville creates a naval court in Nova Scotia to keep this in order, to try to keep things in order. And now he's even enforcing those old navigation acts and brings in some more. We'll see one called the Molasses Act of 1733. This was an old sugar tax, old molasses, sugar, right? It was an old thing. We're not talking about the Sugar Act of 64 yet. We'll get there in a second. Okay? But there was this old Molasses Act of 1733 that said they had to pay tax on sugar. Okay, that was an old sugar tax. They were trying to stop French sugar from coming in, but it was always ignored, especially by those who were making rum. Again, think people like John Hancock. So they're trying to stop French sugar from coming in, but that Molasses Act of 33 was always ignored. So Grenville issues the Sugar Act of 1764. This cut the old tax in half. Why does he do this? Why is he, if people aren't paying taxes, why does he reduce the tax? To get more people to pay it, right? Y'all, think about it. If the tax is $10, let's just throw it out there, $10, and nobody's paying it. Well, if I reduce the tax to $5 and some people pay it, well then hey, I'm making some money, right? We're going to cut down on the smuggling. We're going to collect some taxes. It's going to be better, right? So reducing it, it's think about those things that stores put on clearance, right? Those things that are on clearance used to be $50. Like their regular sale price is $50, but it just hasn't sold yet. So either the store could leave it on the shelf till some random person comes around and buys it for $50, or they could hurry up and drop the price on it to $25 and hurry up and sell it and get it out the store, right? So that's kind of what we're seeing here. So Grenville issues the Sugar Act of 64. This cut the old tax in half. He hoped they would get more legal trade. He also imposed new taxes on other items like wine, coffee, and indigo. This is important because it was the first time that Parliament focused explicitly on the colonies and not the entire empire. It was the first time that Parliament is singling out the colonies. It sucks when we all get punished. But when you feel like the teacher singles you out, or mom and dad punish you and nobody else, that's when you really get upset, right? Like when everybody gets punished, it sucks. But when you're the only one who gets punished, y'all, and I'll think about it another way. A lot of you could probably relate to this one, right? You're driving down the road, and there's like 10 cars, right? And you're all doing 65 and a 55, and the cop pulls you over, and only you. You get really upset because you feel like you're being singled out, right? So that's what we see happening. Okay. So again, this really upset the colonists because it's the first time they feel like they're getting picked on, so to speak. It's the first time they're being treated differently than the people back in England, at least in a negative sense, right? Then we're going to get the Currency Act of 1764. The colonists were running out of coin money, so they started printing their own. But their paper money isn't as valuable as English coins. Think about it. Like, Chuck E. Cheese coins are only good at Chuck E. Cheese, right? Like, they're not good everywhere else, okay? So they're running out of coin money, so they started printing their own. But it's not as valuable as English coins. The English didn't like it because it devalued all the money, right? Like, if we start allowing extra money, think about it. If you have a dollar bill, and then all of a sudden we can use monopoly money, like monopoly money becomes legal, well, your dollar bill isn't worth as much anymore, right? So that becomes this weird thing. So this causes money to devalue more, and the colonists hit a big rough patch, okay? So Grenville, England didn't like it because it devalued money, so Grenville stops it. Like, he stops them from printing money, okay? This causes the money to devalue even more, and the colonists hit a big rough patch because the little money they do have is worthless. The little bit of paper money they do have is now worthless because Grenville said you can't use it. That really hurts them, and especially considering, we just finished the war in 1763. Here we are with the Currency Act of 64. We're trying to recover from a war, and now the little bit of money we did have is now worthless. So it really hurt the post-war economy. Then we get the Stamp Act, okay? Grenville knew he needed more money to pay for those troops who were leaving the West. Remember, I told you at the end of chapter 4, the British are going to leave about 10,000 troops. Why? To keep the colonists from going west of the mountains, right? To stop the fighting between the British colonists, aka the Americans, and the Native Americans, right? So, how are you going to pay for those 10,000 troops? Stamp Act. Grenville knew he needed more money to pay for the troops in the West, so he comes up with the Stamp Act. All legal and printed documents, kind of like a notary stamp, had to have it, y'all. Like, if you've ever seen somebody if you've ever had to get something notarized, think about it like that. But it wasn't just legal documents, y'all. It was all legal and printed documents had to have a stamp. So, everything from newspapers to almanacs, college diplomas, licenses, a deck of playing cards, right? anything. So y'all, if you used to get a newspaper for a nickel, and now the newspaper company has to pay 1 cent for every one of those stamps, to pay a cent to put a stamp on every one of their newspapers. Are they going to still sell you the newspaper for 5 cents? No, they're going to pass that cost on you. So now you have to pay 6 cents for your newspaper. Why? Just because they had to put a stamp on it. What good does that do? But Grenville needed money, so that's what he does. Again, it's kind of like a notary stamp today, but y'all, it was everything from newspapers to almanacs, college diplomas, licenses, playing cards, everything. Okay? And then finally, we get the Quartering Act. Had to supply British troops with room and board. This hit New York hard because the British troops were headquartered there. Now, again, when we talk about quartering, this is a big thing, and I think I've mentioned this maybe I've mentioned this a little bit before, but if I haven't, I'm gonna take some time to talk about it here. Y'all think about that. What quartering was basically you're gonna have a military official, a general, whoever, walk up, knock on your door, and say, "Yes, we see that you have a 3-bedroom home. We need you to house these 2 men. John here, John and Jimmy are both soldiers. John works the day shift, Jimmy works the night shift, so one of them will be here basically all the time. We need you to take one of your rooms. It is no longer for your family. One of your rooms, you choose it, whatever, is going to be for these 2 men. They'll share a room. Again, one's going to work the day shift, one's going to work the night shift. You're responsible for cleaning their uniform and providing them with meals so that they can have something. Quartering Act, providing room and board to these officials. Now, the idea was that the colonial governments would reimburse the families. If you're waiting on the government to reimburse you, you feel pretty confident in that? A lot of people at this time didn't. They were rightfully so. They're not going to get reimbursed. But even taking it a step further, right? And not to get overly involved in this and not to talk bad about the British military, but how do you feel how do you feel about the threat? Real or not? Real or simply perceived? The threat of sexual violence, right? You have these soldiers who, many of them came over during the French and Indian War and are still around. Many of these soldiers maybe fought in other wars before they came over for the French and Indian War. And they are here. They haven't been home. They haven't seen their families, their wives in a really long time. And now here it is, you have these 2 men. Let's say you're a father. Let's say you're a brother. Whatever the case is. And your wife, your sister, your daughter, they stay at home during the day while you go off and go to work. And that guy who works the day shift, yeah, he's gone. But the guy who works the night shifts, he's still there. He's still roaming around the house, right? How do you feel about that threat of violence, right? Whether it actually happens or not, the threat is still there. And that becomes something that really that angers a lot of people. Not just the sexual violence threat of it, but the idea of the cost. How much does it cost to house and to take care of all these people? What does it cost ultimately to give up your personal private space? Like, that's your home, and you're being forced to allow some stranger that you don't know to come into your home. And to top it off, what happens if you just don't like these people? All of those different things come into play. Okay? Now, ultimately, the colonists are outraged at all of this. They believed it went against the general English laws. Again, where general English laws, what will become the rallying cry very much of the American colonists. This. No taxation without representation, right? This is a license plate from Washington, D.C. It actually says taxation without representation because it's this really funny thing, like in D.C., Washington, D.C., in our nation's capital. There's this weird thing of like how they're represented. They don't exactly have representation in the same way that the state of Louisiana does, or the state of Texas, or whatever. So it's this really weird thing. So they still actually have this on their license plate. People in Washington, D.C. still have this on their license plate. Again, taxation without representation. Okay. But anyway, what we see is this idea they're saying, like the people in Washington, D.C. are saying they're still getting taxed without proper representation. That's where that, or at least that model of license plate came from. But these colonists are just outraged at all this. They believe it goes against the general English laws. They say, you can't tax me on all this stuff without representation. They say that Grenville didn't check with the American assemblies on any of these taxes. Like, he just put him in place. He didn't check with anybody on him. The court in Nova Scotia had no jury, and the burden of proof was on the defendant. What that means, y'all, here in America today, we live under the idea that you're innocent until proven guilty, right? Like, they have to, like, the courts have to prove you're guilty. If they can't prove that you're guilty, then you're innocent. Well, here it was different. Here you were guilty until you could prove that you were innocent. Well, y'all, like, how do you prove you didn't do something? Right? Like, think about that. If you didn't do something, how do you prove that you didn't do it? Right? Like, that becomes this thing. And then also, there's no jury. So, what happens if you just wake up, or like, you go to court, and the judge that day is just woke up on the wrong side of the bed, was just a mean guy, or he hates the color blue, and you wore a blue shirt, right? Like, how do you deal with that? Okay. So Grenville didn't check with the American assemblies on any of the taxes. The court in Nova Scotia had no jury, and the burden of proof was on the defendant. We see groups like the Sons of Liberty, who finally begin to protest and even call for a colonial congress to discuss the matter. Now, this isn't the Continental Congress yet. This is just a colonial congress to discuss the matter. This congress says Parliament could regulate trade, but could not impose new taxes. Those had to come from the colonists. Again, the idea of consensual self-government. Again, so that Congress said Parliament could regulate trade but not impose new taxes. They had to come from the colonies. Again, this idea of consensual self-government. We are going to govern ourselves. So again, y'all, we see what? We see Grenville. We see the English Parliament coming in, acting as our boss, overseeing everything we do, when we've been doing it on our own for a long time before. So the colonists also ignored the Stamp Act and began boycotting British goods. Next, Grenville was removed from power, not because of the colonists, but because he had some problems with the king. So ultimately, Grenville's going to be removed from power. Again, I told you, the king doesn't always get along with his ministers, keeps changing them out, and we see that happening here. So Grenville will be removed. So then we get the Marquis of Rockingham. Okay, the Marquis of Rockingham comes in, and he actually sides with the colonists. He repeals the Stamp Act, but he and one of Parliament's leaders, a guy by the name of William Pitt, not the William Pitt from the war, that William Pitt's son. So like this is William Pitt the Younger, is what he's often referred to. Okay, but anyway, the Marquis of Rockingham sides with the colonists. He repeals the Stamp Act. He gets rid of the Stamp Act, but he and one of Parliament's leaders, William Pitt, issue the Declaratory Act. It said Parliament had the right to pass any law in regards to the colony. Okay. It said Parliament had the right, in essence, the Declaratory Act says Parliament is declaring they have the right to pass any law in regards to the colonies. They repealed the Stamp Act, but still showed force. Okay? And so what we're doing here is they're saying, like, Rockingham comes in and says, colonists, I agree with you. This is a bad law. But we as Parliament can do whatever we want. We are Parliament. We are in control. So any law we want to pass in regards to you, governing you in the colonies, we can do it. But I agree with you, this is a bad one. So I'm going to take it away. So he's showing force. He's still showing that Parliament is in control. But he's giving in to the colonists by repealing the Stamp Act. Okay? Well, now we get another minister, Charles Townshend. Okay? Townshend was the Secretary of Treasury. He wanted to make money. He's the Secretary of Treasury. He wants to make money. That's his big thing. So we get the Revenue Act of 1767. Okay, it put taxes on imported glass, paint, paper, and tea. Imported glass, paint, paper, and tea. This further upset the colonists. And now we have the Daughters of Liberty bring about their ideas of silent resistance. For instance, what they do is they don't make a big stink, they don't go out and protest so much, but they stopped buying clothes, they stopped buying goods, and started making them on their own, right? So how do you get at somebody? You go after their pocketbook. You go after their money, right? You really want to get somebody to change? You go after their money. Okay, so silent resistance. They stopped buying clothes. They would make them by hand, right? We start to see those things. Well, then, with tension constantly building, we get more problems, okay? So we've seen some back and forth here, y'all, and look at how early this stuff is. We think of the American Revolution of, the Declaration of Independence and yada, yada, yada. Now, there's a lot of stuff that happens before we get to the Declaration of Independence. Look at these things that are happening in '67. That's 9 years earlier than the Declaration of Independence. But then we'll get the Boston Massacre. Boston Massacre is actually March of 1770. With tension constantly building, we get problems. Okay, troops are always around. People don't like this. And again, y'all, it's that idea of, like I said, if we had all of the people, if we had like all the deans, the president of the university, all the administrators on campus in our classroom watching us while we're just going through a normal day, we feel like we constantly under supervision. We kind of feel like, oh, what are they doing? Why are they here? Are they watching us? Are they just trying to catch us doing something wrong? Right? So ultimately, what's going to happen is that the colonists, a group of colonists, are going to start throwing rocks at a British sentry. A sentry is a guy he's the gatekeeper, right? He's the keeper of the gate. So you have this British facility, and the dude who's out there standing at the gate, guarding the gate. What happens is that a couple kids actually start throwing some snowballs. Well, a couple people start putting rocks in the snowballs, and then throwing the rocks or throwing these rock-filled snowballs at the guard, at the British sentry, right? Well, y'all, let's think about this from a very logical standpoint. If you are a person who is in charge of guarding a gate, and somebody then starts throwing rocks at you, trying to like hurt you, do you believe it would be reasonable for you to feel like you were under attack? That's reasonable. Like, that's a reasonable thought, right? Say, oh, well, it's a bunch of kids throwing snowballs. Well, that's how some people are going to play it out. But if you're not trying to hurt somebody, you're not putting rocks in those snowballs. And more importantly, why would they be throwing snowballs at the guard? Right? So there's this dynamic. But if you're that guard, you can very easily understand how you would feel threatened. So what's he do? He calls for more people. He calls for backup, right? Well, then what happens? You have a group of people. You have two groups of people who don't like each other. And then all of a sudden, something happens, right? Y'all, and I joke about this, but if you went to a high school where there were fights or something, you see a crowd of people walking up, and you're like, yeah, something about to happen. Let me watch, right? Like so you have the two groups of people who don't like each other. They're kind of at odds. There's a lot of yelling, a lot of fighting, and then something happens. Shots are fired. Whether it's intentional, accidental, whether somebody just feels all of a sudden they feel threatened and they don't know what happens, or maybe somebody trips and shots get fired. Okay, so troops were always around. The people don't like this. The colonists started throwing rocks at a British sentry. It gets out of hand real quick, and ultimately we have the Boston Massacre. Now, y'all, when I tell you the Boston Massacre, unfortunately we live in this world where massacre takes on this context of a huge number of people, right? Y'all, when we look at the Boston Massacre, 5 people died and 8 more were wounded. Y'all, I'm not saying that the total of those 13 people didn't matter. Please don't misunderstand me in saying that. But we unfortunately live in a world today here, I'm recording this video in 2020, where, we've all lived through, maybe not personally, hopefully not personally, but we've lived through a world where we've seen school shootings, where school shootings have had more victims than this, right? And as horribly unfortunate as it is, we see, but y'all, what terminology is used here? Massacre. And I'm not saying that's the wrong terminology, but think about this is what I'm saying by words and how words can influence things. The American colonists will talk about this as a massacre. Yo, again, whether it's right or it's wrong, in 2020, when we call 5 people dying and 8 more wounded, would we call that a massacre? Right? It's something we contemplate. It's something, again, showing how sides and perspective matters, right? To the American colonists, this is a massacre. But to others, it might not be. Okay? So ultimately, Boston Massacre again, 5 people died, 8 more wounded. The soldiers were taken to trial. But John Adams, who will go on to become second president, y'all, I'm gonna let you know this right now. I'm a huge fan of John Adams as well as his son John Quincy Adams. I'm not gonna sit here and say that they didn't have any faults. Lord knows we will talk about all those faults, y'all. I will gladly tell you about their faults. But I'm a huge fan of John Adams and John Quincy Adams. I love to study them. They are some of my favorite people to study because of who they were, how they acted differently than a lot of the people of their time. But nonetheless, John Adams defends these soldiers. He won most of the cases, and those he lost, he suffered minor. The cases that he lost, those people only suffered minor penalties. Y'all, and think about what that means. This is one of the reasons that I love to study John Adams, because you have this guy who, y'all, by all accounts, John Adams is one of the leading American patriots. He will become, outside of George Washington, like there's a reason why he's our second president. He's a reason why he's our first vice president. Because people understand, outside of George Washington, very few people did as much for American independence as John Adams. Yet that man has an internal morality about him that says these people still deserve a fair trial. Now, were those people, is there any way that those soldiers would get a fair trial in Boston? No. But somehow John Adams is able to do his job effectively, and yet get most of these men to be found not guilty. In the cases that they were found guilty, they only suffered minor penalties. Okay. Now we're gonna get a new wrong way. We're gonna get a new treasurer, a new minister of treasury by the name of Lord North. He repeals the Revenue Act of 1767, except on tea. Okay, so he repeals the Revenue Act of 1767, except on tea. And over the next couple of years, tensions die down. But Samuel Adams, yes, y'all, Samuel Adams is the cousin of John Adams, okay? But Samuel Adams, who becomes known as the penman of the Revolution, refuses to let it fall apart. He organized committees of correspondence, which what they did was these were groups kind of connected to the Sons of Liberty, and what they did was these committees of correspondence repeatedly spread propaganda, spread the idea. Y'all, think about, we all have those friends, y'all. Here in 2020, we are seeing a lot of social activism, and regardless of what side you're on in that social activism, again, y'all, that's your beliefs, that's your opinion, it doesn't matter to me. But y'all, no matter where you stand on these ideas of social activism, social justice, and whatnot, you see a lot of people who do what? Who say, I'm just tired of seeing this, I'm tired of seeing that, I'm tired of seeing this. But you have those select people who say what? I'm not going to let you forget it. They're always sharing things on social media. They're always talking about these things, right? That's Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams is the penman of the Revolution. He refuses to let these ideas, he refuses to let these things that he sees as personal transgressions of the British government to the American colonists. He refuses to let them die down. He refuses to let people just forget about it and move on with their life. He's going to keep reminding people of what they're doing and how he believes that what the British are doing is wrong. Okay? So again, over the next couple of years, tensions die down. But Samuel Adams, the penman of the Revolution, refuses to let it fall apart. He organized the committees of correspondence. There were groups that wrote back and forth to each other and shared news throughout the colonies. And again, part of what they did was they spread propaganda showing, again, from their perspective, how so many things that the British were doing were ultimately wrong. Now, Lord North now decides to help the failing English East India Company. The English East India Company is it's a company. It's a really, really big, important company back in England. But it starts to do bad business. Like they start to like they're failing as a business. So Lord North allowed the company to sell directly to the colonies. Remember all those navigation acts? He's basically waving like you don't have to abide by them. He allowed the company to sell directly to the colonies. So what's that mean? The colonists will get cheaper tea, right? Like if the company doesn't have to sell or doesn't have to go through England or do these different things, they can sell tea cheaper, right? But what happened is that the colonists still had to pay the taxes. So it allowed the company to sell directly to the colonies, but the colonists still had to pay taxes. The colonists didn't get upset because they see it as the English trying to buy them off with cheap tea. Like, wait, like you think you can get out of all of this by just selling us cheaper tea? Like, you're reducing the price, but I'm still paying taxes on it. Why don't you take the tax off of it? Right? Like, that's ultimately what they're saying. Like, yeah, just because you drop the price from $10 to $15, that's great and all, but I'm still paying a tax on it. And that's not right. That's what I feel is wrong. Not the price of the tea, but the taxes. Okay? And so the colonists still had to pay taxes, so they're upset because they see it as the English trying to buy them off with cheap tea. Now, the committees of correspondence talk about this a lot, and we will get some problems because in December of 1773, some colonists sneak onto some ships and dump the tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party, right? Um, Y'all, the Boston Tea Party, what we see is a group of colonists. I think the number is right around 100. And basically, you had some of them that dressed up as Native Americans, some of them that dressed up like kind of dressed in black and put oil black on their face to kind of mask their face. And you had some that just didn't care. They're like, I don't care if they see me, I'm just going up here. And they dumped all this tea into the harbor. Now, let's keep a couple things in mind. Number one, tea is not like the tea we think of today. These were like blocks of tea, and so they throw it into the harbor. It's kind of like throwing giant blocks of soap into the harbor. Also, question I've always wondered, and like I don't know that I'll ever get a good, accurate answer. Number one, because I've just never really taken the time to research it, but it's always something I question every time I talk about it. Like, what was the ecological impact of the Boston Tea Party? Like, what happened to the fish? Right? Like, you dump all this tea into the harbor. Like, y'all, today we live in a world where, like, if there's an oil spill or a chemical spill, like, oh, I'm just curious, like, what happened to the fish? You know? Anyway, point being, that's neither here nor there. But anyway, what we see is we have these problems because the colonists will sneak onto the ship, dump a bunch of tea into the harbor, and now the British government is upset. The English East India Company is upset because they're in essence losing all this money. They have to try to dig this tea or like salvage this tea out of the harbor, but how do they do that effectively? The British government's upset because they're not going to get to collect tax money on all of this, and it's this big, huge ordeal. Okay. Now, something else that also happens around the same time as the Boston Tea Party, we have another thing that's really going to anger the colonists. And that is going to be that Parliament will pass the Quebec Act. It gave French Catholics land in the Ohio River Valley, land that the colonists wanted for themselves. Now, I'm going to pull this back up, okay? Y'all, when we looked at this, what did we see here, okay? We saw the Proclamation of 1763, right? Told the colonists, don't go past here. The Quebec Act did what? It gave French Catholics land over here in the Ohio River Valley. So you have English colonists who want, where'd my mouse go? You have English colonists who want to move out there. And they're told, no, you can't move there. But then these French Catholics are told, oh yeah, you can move over here. And the British are like, that's just not fair. That's supposed to be land for us. Y'all, it's this idea that, your parents got a new car, right? Like you just learned how to drive, you just got your license, your parents got a new car, but they won't let you drive it. They won't let you drive it. They say you can't do it. Well, then your deadbeat, low down, like mooch off of everybody cousin comes over and wants to borrow the car. And your parents are like, oh yeah, here you go, take it from. You're like, you're gonna let him, but not me? Well, y'all, I'm not saying that French Catholics were these low down people, but to the British colonists, that's the way they see it, right? They see it as like, wait, that's British land. We are British citizens, and you're telling us we can't go there, but those French Catholics can. That's just not fair. And so the Boston Tea Party, all of these things are really, really upsetting the American colonists, okay? So they'll protest over that. We ultimately see, again, so we have the Quebec Act that happens. We see the Boston Tea Party that happens. All of these things, again, constantly leading to tensions between the American colonists and the British. Now, one thing I want you to understand, and I should have mentioned it earlier when I talked about my license plate, okay? But something I want you to pay attention to in this is real simple, y'all. How is it that the British are going to tell the Americans you have representation, but the Americans believe that they don't have representation? Okay? This is what it is. The way British Parliament worked at that time was that every member of Parliament represented every member of the Empire. And if that doesn't make sense to you, let me explain it in this way. In the United States, we have the senators, right? And each state has 2 senators, right? So there's 100 senators. Okay, each state gets to elect 2 people to be their senators at the United States level. Imagine if there was not a rule about how many came from which state. What happens if there was just a rule that said the U.S. is going to have 100 senators? Do you think a place like California might get more than 2, and maybe a place like Idaho might not get any? Like, oh well, California is so populated, they're going to have a bunch of people are going to vote for their people, and nobody from Idaho is going to have a shot to win, right? Well, that's what was happening. The British government said, Parliament, every member of Parliament represents the entirety of the empire. But the Americans are saying, but there's nobody from America in Parliament, because there was no representative. There was nobody in Parliament that was from the colonies. And so the American colonists say, you don't know what it's like to be here. How can you be my representative when you have no clue what it's like to be here? We have different ideas, we have different needs, we have different desires, right? And so that plays into all of this. Now, again, we had the Boston Tea Party, we had the Quebec Act. Now, Parliament issued the Coercive Acts, okay? So what happens with the Coercive Acts? Y'all, these are also known as the Intolerable Acts. The British call them the Coercive Acts. We're going to coerce the colonists to act the way we want them to. And the American colonists are saying, these acts are intolerable. We cannot stand them. We cannot tolerate these acts. They are intolerable. So the English are truly upset after the Boston Tea Party, so they pass the Coercive Acts, aka the Intolerable Acts. What do these acts do? First of all, they shut down the port of Boston until the city paid for the tea. Until the city or the port of Boston paid for the tea, no boats in or out of the port of Boston. Secondly, they enacted a new and harsher quartering act. They made it more difficult. They made it harsher, like more people living in those homes, yada yada yada. And then the third thing is they said officials would now be tried in England. Y'all, if you were guilty of a crime in the American colonies because you didn't collect, like you were a tax collector and you didn't collect the proper taxes, well, the people in the colonies would probably like, oh yeah, that's great, we'll find you not guilty. But if you then got put on trial in England, is it a different story? Yeah, so where you're being put on trial would become a big deal. So they shut down the port of Boston until it paid for the tea. They enacted a new harsher quartering act, and officials would now be tried in England. Now, all of this was supposed to punish Boston. All of this was designed to punish the city of Boston for the Boston Tea Party. But what it actually did was it brought some colonial unity. It brought some unity to the colonies. Now the colonies are going to start to unite. What we see is that we'll start to see places like Virginia or the Carolinas, New York start to say, if they did that to Boston, they can maybe do that to us. Now I want you to keep in mind, I want you to understand this, y'all, as we move forward throughout this first part of American history. There are two colonies, aka 2 states eventually, that are going to be the people who start stuff in American history. Massachusetts, we see that happening here with Boston, and South Carolina. Okay, so keep that in mind, y'all. Massachusetts and South Carolina are our stuff starters in American history. Again, through this first half, roughly, of American history that we look at, those 2 states are often, when something's going to happen, those should be your first guesses of where something might happen, okay? But what we see is ultimately that the Coercive Acts brought a little bit of unity to the American colonies, because now all of the colonies start to realize, well, if they did that to Boston, they could do that to us. They could do that to other people too. So maybe we need to start acting as one group instead of 13 different colonies. And we start to get a little bit of unity. Okay? Okay, so now with some colonial unity, let's see what happens. Okay? We'll get the First Continental Congress. It first organized on September 5th, 1774. Actually coming up on the anniversary of that. So with some colonial unity, we get the First Continental Congress that organizes on September 5th, 1774. This Congress approved the Suffolk Resolves. Suffolk, S-U-F-F-O-L-K, the Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves said the following: the Intolerable Acts were null and void. They're like, we're not abiding by that. That law, those coercive acts, are wrong, they're unlawful, they're unjust, we're not going to follow. Said that Intolerable Acts, aka coercive acts, were null and void, They put their own economic sanctions on England. They called for the Continental Association to let every town enforce a total boycott of British goods. So they're putting their own economic sanctions on England. They wanted a total boycott. The Suffolk Resolves asked for a total boycott of British goods. If it comes from Great Britain, don't buy it. Hit them where it hurts. Hit them in the pocketbook, right? Don't buy anything that comes from Great Britain, because we're going to make it a point to show them we mean business. It also called, the Suffolk Resolves also called for mobilizing the militia, again the local military. Okay. Now, what did the colonists do to coercive acts? They just ignored them. What do you think the British are going to do to these Suffolk Resolves? Just like the colonies, the British refused to give in, and so we're going to get some more problems. Okay. The British will send over a man by the name of Thomas Gage, General Thomas Gage, to keep things in order. He's sent to Boston, kind of like, look, Boston's right now the hot spot. Things are getting crazy. They send General Thomas Gage over to kind of keep things in order. Now, in April of 1775, on April 19th, 1775, think about it. We haven't even gotten to the Declaration of Independence yet. But on April 19th, 1775, he sent troops to Lexington and Concord. Why? He sent troops to Lexington and Concord to confiscate war material. Like, there were rumors that the colonists were gathering up weapons, gathering up cannon and other weapons, and kind of getting ready. Because Boston was kind of, Boston is surrounded and controlled by the British military. So the people on the outskirts of Boston were gathering up weapons, and so General Gage sends troops to Lexington and Concord to confiscate war material and to arrest two people, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Y'all understand this. John Hancock, like Samuel Adams was the penman of the Revolution, early on John Hancock is the money of the Revolution. He's the guy who, again, he's a rum smuggler. So he's a guy who has a lot of money, and he was losing money by all of these new taxes and different things like that. So he has money. He finances. He pays for a lot of things that Samuel Adams wants. He pays for a lot of these different ventures when it comes to looking at how can I put this? Looking at the early stages of the revolution. So if Samuel Adams is penman of the revolution, think about John Hancock as the money of the revolution. He was the financer of the revolution. Okay, so they go to Lexington and Concord to confiscate this war material, arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But because of Paul Revere and two others who made a midnight ride, again, there was a secret, basically spy network within Boston. They find out that the troops are going to be moving out. So Paul Revere and two others make the famous midnight ride to warn the cities. Now that gives the Massachusetts militia a chance to get prepared, and they wait for the British. A small skirmish occurs in Lexington. This will be known as the shot heard around the world, and we'll come back to that. On April 19th, 1775, we get the shot heard around the world. A small skirmish occurs in Lexington, and the British move on to Concord, but don't get much because it was already moved because of Revere's warning. So again, most of the colonists had heard about this, had heard of the warning, and so they started hiding things and started putting it to where the British couldn't find it, right? So the British move on to Concord, but don't get much because it was already moved because of Revere's warning. On the way back to Boston, the British were followed and attacked by the American militia. These people had heard about Lexington, and many came to fight. The British have to go back under constant fire, and approximately 250 British soldiers were killed or wounded during this event. Okay, let's look at all that. That's a lot to break down. Okay, so the Americans here, because of Paul Revere and others who made the midnight ride, the Americans are warned. John Hancock, Samuel Adams are able to get out of town before the British can find them. Most of the American weapons are put into hiding before the British get there. But what happens is that the American militia at Lexington is there waiting in Lexington Square, waiting in like the town square, right? And the British march up. Now, it doesn't sound like much because you have the British regulars against a bunch of ragtag, podunk, nobody American colonist militiamen. And there's a few shots fired, but nothing really big happens. But y'all, it's the shot heard around the world. These are the first shots. Oftentimes, when most people look at it, battle at Lexington Square is the first shots of the American Revolution. America hasn't even declared its independence, but yet we call that the first shots of the American Revolution. And we call it shot heard around the world. And this is why, y'all understand this. It's not because literally they heard that shot over in India. No, it's not that. It's because the American Revolution then really begins in earnest. And what we see here, not so much with the Boston Massacre, because y'all, Boston Massacre happened 5 years earlier. But what we see moving forward is that ultimately the Americans move forward and will gain their independence. And here at Lexington, we see the shot heard around the world. Y'all, the American Revolution that we are beginning to get into right now gets going and will have a ripple effect that it starts a chain reactions. It starts a chain reaction of revolutions around the world. You know, the American Revolution happens in the 1770s and 80s. Then what? Late 1780s, early 1790s, into the 1800s, we have the French Revolution. Then in the early 1800s, we see the revolutions in Central and South America. And we see that, y'all, it's a chain reaction of revolutions where the colonies in America, whether it's the British colonies, the Spanish colonies, Portuguese colonies, whatever it is, they will start to fight for their independence and start to gain footing on the world stage. These revolutions ultimately changed world society. And so that's why we call it the shot heard around the world. Now, again, the British go into Lexington, small skirmish, they go on to conquer, they look for some weapons, they don't really find much. On their way back to Boston. Now think about it. So they left Boston, they stopped in Lexington, then they went on to Concord, right? Well, while they're marching all the way back to Boston, they're under constant attack. People, think about it. By the time they make it to Concord, the people in Lexington done told everybody and their mama about what happened, and so the entire way back from Concord to Boston, the British are under attack. You see American militia sitting in the woods, sitting in the, hunkering out, hiding in the trees as the British go by, and the British are constantly being attacked. And again, about 250 are either killed or wounded during this. Now, what it shows is that the British had a lot of work to do. They couldn't just come in and control the city of Boston and think they won. It shows that they will literally have to conquer the entire country. Now, in May of 1775, we get the Second Continental Congress, who also meets in Philadelphia on May 10th, 1775. So again, in May of 1775, we get the Second Continental Congress, also in Philadelphia. They choose George Washington to lead the Continental Army. They do so for a couple different reasons. Number one, he had some experience. It's not great experience, right? He got surrounded and had to surrender to the French, but he does have some experience. But also because he's from Virginia. Where's all the stuff happening? In Boston, in New England, right? New York is the headquarters of the British Army. But Virginia and the southern colonies aren't seeing the problems as readily. So by getting George Washington, it kind of brings the South in. It brings the South into this fight. It makes it a national thing, not just a regional thing. Also with that, what else do we see? We see the idea that George Washington's wealthy. He has a lot of money and he could help pay for the war. So again, why did they choose George Washington? Why did they choose George Washington? He had some experience. He's from the South, so that will bring the Southerners into the war, or bring Southerners into the conflict, and he has money, so he could help pay for it. Now, at the same time that the Second Continental Congress is meeting, we see Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold will strike at Fort Ticonderoga. This gains the Americans tons of weapons, so we see some progress. Hey, look, the Americans are picking George Washington, but what else do we see? We see Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. Remember those names, in particular Benedict Arnold. Winning at Fort Ticonderoga. They take the fort, they beat the British there, and they take all the weapons. Now the Americans have more weapons. Those weapons can be moved and used somewhere else. And that's where we get to Bunker and Breeds Hill. Then in June of 1775, we get the Battle of Bunker Hill. Militiamen came from all over, not just from around Massachusetts, but from all across the colonies. Militiamen came from all over to help Boston, because it was still occupied by the British. So think about it. We had the Boston Tea Party that happens, And here we are in June of 1775, and Boston is still lingering, or excuse me, the British military is still controlling Boston. Okay, so militiamen came from all over to help Boston. It was still occupied by the British Army. The Americans gathered at Breed's Hill, which is a high point. Y'all, we call it the Battle of Bunker Hill, but it really took place at Breed's Hill. I think I've maybe used this line before, but it's kind of like the New Orleans airport that's really in Metairie, right? Or really in Kenner, right? So we kind of see that. Anyway, y'all, the militiamen came from all over to help Boston. It was still occupied. It was still occupied by the British. The Americans gathered at Breed's Hill, which was a high point. The British attack. The British are going to attack. They're going to attack up the hill. Now the Americans are short on ammunition, so they're given the order: don't shoot until you see the whites of the eyes. Make sure they're close because you don't want to miss. We can't afford for you to miss because we don't have a lot of ammunition. Not to shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. It works twice. The British charge once, they get repelled. The British charge a second time, they get repelled. But the third British charge succeeded. So the British won. The British take the hill, but they took the hill with a lot of casualties. And y'all, think about it like this. Sometimes you win, but that win is a costly win. Think about a sports team, right? Think about a team that won the game, but their best player got injured in the game. Well, damn, that really sucks, right? Like, I might take one loss over losing my best player, right? So what we see here is that the British won, but it was a very costly victory. They took large casualties. Now, with all of this, even with all of this, the Continental Congress tries to be civil. They come up with the Olive Branch Petition. They said they were loyal to the king, and if the bad taxes, the bad acts, like the coercive acts, if all of that was repealed, they would stop fighting. So the American colonists are still trying to be peaceful about this. The Continental Congress says, here's our Olive Branch Petition. Now, an olive branch is known as a symbol of peace. So they offer this symbol of peace and say, look, if you get rid of these bad taxes, you get rid of these bad acts, we will stop fighting. King George III, however, refused. He declared them rebellious enemies. So King George III refuses and declares them rebellious enemies. So now in the fall of 1775, the Americans decide to go on the offensive. They decide, all right, fine, we're going to attack. We try to be nice, but now we're going to attack. So in the fall of 1775, the Americans decide to go on the offensive. They want to attack Canada. They want to make it the 14th colony. They want to leave no British in North America. 2 different units attack Quebec, but both fail. Now we have a stalemate going into the winter. So now going into the winter of 1775 to 76, we're at a stalemate. The Americans tried to conquer British Canada, but that didn't really work. They wanted to get rid of all the British totally, but again, that didn't really work. So we're at a stalemate. We're kind of at a point where both sides are just there and nobody's making any real progress. Then in early 1776, Thomas Paine wrote a little pamphlet that was called Common Sense. And he asks why the tiny island of England controls the large American colonies. So in early 1776, Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. It was a pamphlet, okay? And asks why the tiny island of England controls the large American colonies. He said Americans had a moral obligation to gain independence. That spoke to many Americans and got them involved. Again, said Americans had a moral obligation to gain independence. This spoke to many Americans and got them involved. We've all had those moments in life where something seems far off, it doesn't seem real to us or whatever, and then something happens and something makes it real to us, right? Like there's finally a person who in our family or close to us who gets diagnosed with cancer, or we see hurricanes that pass through and oh, that's over there. Then when a hurricane hits our home, we're like, oh man, now I get it, right? We all have those moments where something becomes real for us. Thomas Paine's Common Sense made the American Revolution real for many people across the colonies, okay? It put a personal touch to it. It made it real to them. So now, in the summer of 1776, we get the Declaration of Independence. It was drafted by Thomas Jefferson. There were other people involved. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, were all helped author the Declaration of Independence. But when it came down to it, Jefferson wrote it. It's largely Jefferson's words. Okay, it's really neat because Jefferson was this really quiet individual. John Adams is a big talker. but Thomas Jefferson was a big writer. And so Adams and Franklin are like, no, Jefferson, you write. You are the guy with the great pen. You write. You write it. And so, yes, other people had influence there, other people that are involved in it, but it's largely Jefferson's words. Um, and what the Declaration of Independence did was it reasoned or it explained why the Americans were rebelling. Again, it explained, it reasoned why. It lists, if you look at the Declaration of Independence and you read it, you see it's basically like people talk about it, people joke and throw memes out there. It's like the greatest breakup letter of all time. But it's a list of reasons of why we were rebelling. It's a list of reasons of like why the relationship wasn't working out for us. So it reasoned why the Americans were rebelling. It said all men were equal and should have a chance to get life, liberty, and happiness. Does that sound vaguely familiar? Remember John Locke, life, liberty, and property? Well, here Jefferson changes it almost to the point of plagiarism, right? To say life, liberty, and happiness. It says that we didn't feel equal to the people in England. We didn't have nobody from Parliament was from the Americas, so we don't feel equal to the people in England. And finally, it said that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. Government derives its power from the consent or the approval. Think about it. A large reason why our class works is because you consent. You approve of you approve of how I'm running the class, right? If somebody just stood up in class every day, stood up on their desk and danced and screamed, whatever, well then I couldn't conduct class properly, right? But because you all consent and you understand and you sit in your desk and you listen and we have class in a proper fashion because you agree to that, it's able to work. But if all of you collectively said, no, this isn't working for me, we ain't going to do it, we're going to boycott it, we're going to fight it, then it wouldn't work. And so that's what he's saying. Government, the ability to rule, comes from the people that you're ruling over. They have to approve of the way in which you rule for you to rule effectively. So again, government derives its power from the consent of the government. All of this goes to the American goal of consensual self-government. Again, that big theme I've been talking about. The American goal of consensual self-government. We as Americans were determined to govern ourselves. We agree, we consent, we give our approval for us to govern each other. Not for some person or some group in a far-off land to govern us, but us. Not the rulers of that tiny little island over in England, but the people here in America should be governing us. Now, one last thing I want to finish up with here is something from John Adams. Again, I've told you I love to study John Adams, and this is something I find funny. Now, John Adams wrote this to his wife on July 3rd, 1776. On July 3rd, 1776. This is part of a letter from John Adams to his wife, Abigail. But the day has passed. The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other. From this time forward, forevermore. Okay? You don't have to know that quote by heart or anything like that for any test. I read it because of what? He wrote that letter on July 3rd and said the date would be July 2nd. What's interesting, we think about Independence Day as July 4th, 1776. Well, actually, they voted on the Declaration of Independence on July 2nd. That's why he says 2nd. But they all signed it, it got approved on the 2nd and they formalized it on the 4th. Think about it like that, right? So to us, we celebrate the 4th of July. But here John Adams was thinking the date would be the 2nd of July. He's thinking the date everybody will remember would be July 2nd, not July 4th. But look at what he says. We could look at him, we could look at him and laugh oh, ha ha, John Adams, you got it wrong. It's July 4th, not July 2nd that we celebrate. But look at how he explained, look at how he described how people would celebrate the 4th of July. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade. We have big festivals and parades to celebrate the 4th of July? Yeah, we do. With shows, games, sports. Yeah, we do all that stuff on 4th of July. guns, bells, bonfires, illuminations. Yo, guns, bells, bonfires, fireworks, right? All of these different things. Guns, bells, bonfires, illuminations. From one end of this continent to the other. From this time forward, forevermore. Now, he perfectly describes. Here we are in the year, here we are. I mean, he says this in 1776. Here we are almost 250 years later. As I record this video in 2020. Here we are almost 250 years later. And the dude nails it spot on how we would celebrate the 4th of July. I always just find that interesting. So yeah, that wraps up chapter 5, and we will look at chapter 6 in our next video.